The last thing my husband whispered into my ear before he tried to kill me was, "What a waste of your wealth, Audrey. Money means nothing when you can't breathe underwater." Then his hands slammed hard against my back and suddenly the world vanished beneath me. I plunged into the freezing Atlantic Ocean as darkness swallowed me whole. The water hit like concrete shock, ripping through my body while icy salt water flooded my mouth and lungs. I fought violently toward the surface, gasping for air the moment I broke through, only to hear the roaring engines of the yacht already pulling away from me. Panic exploded inside my chest. "Julian," I screamed, choking on seawater, my arms thrashing against the merciless waves. But he didn't stop. Neither did his mother. Margaret Kensington stood beside him on the deck, elegant in white silk, laughing as if she were watching fireworks instead of her daughter-in-law drowning in the middle of the ocean. Her laughter carried across the waves, sharp, cold, and delighted. In that horrifying moment, reality shattered inside me. This wasn't an accident. My husband hadn't slipped. He hadn't lost control. Julian had pushed me overboard on purpose. He had planned this. They both had. Just hours earlier, I had been drinking champagne beside him under the Florida sun, believing we were celebrating our third wedding anniversary on a romantic yacht trip down the Miami coast. I remembered how Julian smiled at me that morning, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear, kissing my forehead like a devoted husband. I remembered feeling grateful that despite his mother's constant cruelty toward me, despite her endless comments about new money and how women like me could never truly belong among old wealth, Julian had always seemed to choose me. I had trusted him completely. That trust was now sinking into the black ocean beside me. The freezing water dragged at my clothes like dead weight, while terror clawed through every inch of my body. My muscles burned from exhaustion, but fear kept me moving. I refused to disappear beneath those waves while they sailed away with my life, my company, and my future. Somewhere deep inside the panic, another emotion began to grow, something darker, harder, far more dangerous than fear. Rage. Because as I watched the yacht vanish into the distance, one brutal truth became painfully clear. They thought I was going to die out there. They thought they had already won. I don't remember how long I fought to stay alive in that ocean. Time dissolved into freezing water, burning lungs, and the endless terror of knowing nobody was coming back for me. Every wave felt heavier than the last, dragging my exhausted body deeper into the Atlantic, while darkness crept into the edges of my vision. My arms were numb. My legs barely responded. More than once I almost stopped fighting. But each time I saw Julian's face in my mind, his calm expression as he pushed me overboard. Margaret's laughter ringing behind him and the rage inside me forced me to keep moving. I refused to die for them. I refused to become another tragic headline they could exploit. Somewhere in the distance, through the blur of seawater and tears, I spotted lights cutting across the darkness. A fishing boat. At first I thought I was hallucinating, but then I heard voices carried by the wind, summoning the last strength left in my body. I raised one trembling arm and screamed until my throat tore raw. The boat changed direction instantly. Within minutes, rough hands grabbed my shoulders and hauled me onto the deck. I collapsed violently against the freezing metal floor, coughing seawater and shaking uncontrollably, while two fishermen wrapped blankets around me. One of them, a weathered older man named Captain Frank, stared down at me with sharp, knowing eyes. "You're lucky we found you," he muttered quietly. "Lucky." The word almost made me laugh. Luck had nothing to do with it. Survival did. And survival meant one thing now: revenge. As the fishing boat turned back toward the Florida coast, something inside me changed completely. The terrified woman drowning in the ocean disappeared somewhere between the waves and the darkness. In her place, something colder emerged. Focused, calculating, dangerous. Julian and Margaret thought I was dead, and for the moment I intended to keep it that way. Captain Frank handed me a satellite phone without asking questions, and I made 3 calls that would change everything. The first was to Renee Carter, my head of security and a former homicide detective who trusted instincts more than appearances. The second was to Gregory Pierce, my attorney, the kind of ruthless litigator billionaires hired when they wanted enemies destroyed legally and permanently. The third was to Valerie Monroe, my closest friend and business partner, the brilliant chemist who had helped me build my biotech empire from nothing. None of them spoke for several seconds after hearing my voice. They had already been told I was dead. Julian had apparently contacted the Coast Guard with a grieving husband's performance, convincing enough to trigger a full ocean search. That realization made my stomach twist with disgust. Even now he was acting, manipulating, preparing to inherit everything I had built. "Listen carefully," I said, my voice still shaking from cold and fury. "Nobody can know I survived. Not the media, not the police, not Julian. I want the world to believe I drowned tonight." Silence followed before Renee finally spoke in the calm, lethal tone that made executives and criminals equally afraid of her. "Understood. What do you need?" I stared out across the black ocean as the fishing boat cut through the waves. "I need war." By the time we reached shore, Valerie was waiting at a private marina with dry clothes, a burner phone, and an SUV with blacked-out windows. The moment she saw me alive, tears filled her eyes, but mine stayed dry. I felt strangely hollow, now emptied out by betrayal and rebuilt with something harder. Renee arrived less than an hour later, carrying files, laptops, and security reports, already compiled during the chaos of my supposed death. Gregory joined us at a secure corporate safe house just after midnight. Together, we sat around a steel conference table while the truth began unfolding piece by piece. Julian had already started moving money. Margaret had activated hidden shell accounts. Internal access requests were appearing across my company systems. They weren't mourning me. They were dividing the empire before my body was even found. That was the moment my fear finally died completely. In its place came absolute clarity. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to hide. I was going to let them believe they had won, and then I was going to destroy every part of their world from the inside out. The deeper we dug into my financial records, the more horrifying the truth became. What I initially believed was an impulsive murder attempt quickly revealed itself as something far more calculated, sophisticated, and monstrous. Julian and Margaret had not decided to kill me overnight. They had been preparing for my death for months, possibly years, carefully constructing a financial web designed to strip away everything I had spent my entire life building. Inside the secure, safe house, Renee sat across from me with multiple monitors glowing in the darkness, while Gregory spread stacks of printed bank records across the conference table. Valerie remained silent beside me, her face pale with disbelief, as transaction after transaction appeared on the screen. Millions of dollars had quietly disappeared from joint accounts connected to my businesses, charitable foundations, and personal investment portfolios. At first, the thefts were subtle, small enough to avoid triggering automatic audits, but over time, they escalated into a massive, coordinated embezzlement operation, hidden beneath layers of shell corporations and offshore accounts. The names of the companies meant nothing at first: fake consulting firms in Delaware, biotech investment groups in the Cayman Islands, real estate holdings, registered through anonymous trusts in Switzerland and Singapore. But Renee traced every single one back to the same source: Margaret Kensington. She built the structure, Renee explained, coldly zooming into a flowchart of transactions that looked more like organized crime than ordinary financial fraud. Julian was just the access point. He used his marriage to you to slowly move money where nobody would notice. My stomach twisted as Gregory slid another folder toward me. Forged legal drafts, transfer authorizations, estate contingency documents prepared months before the yacht trip. Julian had already arranged legal pathways to seize temporary control over portions of my company if I died unexpectedly. Under normal circumstances, my death would trigger a complicated probate process tying up billions in assets. During that chaos, Julian planned to position himself as the grieving widower, responsible for protecting my legacy, while quietly liquidating everything behind the scenes. Margaret would use her political connections, banking relationships, and offshore networks to move the money beyond recovery before federal investigators could untangle the fraud. The sheer scale of it made my skin crawl. This wasn't greed anymore. It was predatory, professional, surgical. And then came the worst part. Renee uncovered encrypted email exchanges between Julian and Margaret dating back nearly a year. I forced myself to read them despite the nausea rising in my throat. They discussed me the way hunters discuss prey. Julian updated his mother on my emotional state, my business decisions, even my insecurities. He told her when I was vulnerable, when I trusted him most, when I was exhausted after major acquisitions or distracted by investor negotiations. Margaret coached him constantly how to manipulate me, how to reassure me whenever I became suspicious, how to keep me emotionally dependent while they tightened control over my finances. One message from Margaret froze my blood completely. The anniversary trip is the perfect opportunity. No witnesses, no body. Grieving husbands inherit sympathy faster than suspicion. My hands started shaking so violently I almost dropped the papers. 5 years. 5 entire years of marriage suddenly collapsed into something hideous and unrecognizable. Every romantic vacation, every late-night conversation, every kiss, every promise, it all felt poisoned now. I remembered the way Julian used to hold me after difficult board meetings, telling me how proud he was of the empire I built. I remembered believing I had finally found someone who loved me for who I was rather than for my wealth or status. But those memories now felt like scenes from a carefully rehearsed performance. I had not been loved. I had been studied, managed, exploited. The realization nearly broke something inside me. Margaret had always despised me openly, but Julian was worse because he had pretended. He had looked into my eyes every single day while secretly planning my death. Even our marriage itself suddenly looked different under the weight of the evidence. Gregory discovered revisions to prenuptial agreements Julian had attempted to push through over the years. Renee uncovered evidence that Margaret had hired private investigators to monitor my assets long before the wedding. Valerie quietly admitted she had always felt something was off about Julian's fascination with my corporate structure and emergency succession plans, but none of us imagined the truth was this dark. This wasn't just a toxic marriage driven by money. It was a long-term infiltration operation orchestrated by a family obsessed with wealth, power, and control. Margaret had targeted me because I was exactly the kind of woman she hated most, a self-made billionaire she couldn't dominate socially. Julian was simply the weapon she used to get close enough to destroy me. For several long minutes, nobody in the room spoke. The only sound was the hum of computer servers and the distant thunder outside the safe house windows. I stared at the evidence scattered across the table and felt grief twisting violently together with fury. I mourned the life I thought I had. I mourned the man I believed I married. But beneath the heartbreak, something colder was forming. Clarity. They had spent years building this trap around me with absolute confidence that I would never see it coming. They believed I was already dead. They believed they were about to inherit my fortune, my company, my home, my future. What they didn't understand was that by failing to kill me, they had made the single greatest mistake of their lives. Because now I knew everything. And once I stopped grieving, there would be nothing left inside me except the desire to destroy them completely. By the time I returned to my mansion in Coral Gables, every piece of the trap was already in motion. Gregory had filed emergency federal motions, freezing all accounts connected to Julian and Margaret's shell corporations. Renee had secured copies of the yacht's GPS data, proving the exact coordinates where Julian shoved me into the Atlantic. Valerie had locked Julian out of every corporate system tied to my biotech empire. Their access cards were dead. Their financial pipelines were collapsing. And hidden inside my blazer pocket was the final weapon, a live audio recorder waiting to capture their downfall in their own words. The house stood glowing against the Miami night, like nothing had happened, its massive glass walls reflecting the lights from Biscayne Bay. Looking at it filled me with a strange coldness. This had once been my sanctuary, the home I designed with Julian after our wedding, the place where I believed we were building a future together. Now it felt like the crime scene of my own attempted murder. Renee waited outside with a team of federal agents positioned nearby in unmarked vehicles, while I stepped silently through the front door using my key. The security alarm didn't activate. Julian had disabled it earlier, probably assuming there was no reason to keep protecting a dead woman's house. The sound of laughter drifted from the living room. Calm, relaxed, celebratory. My chest tightened as I moved quietly across the marble floor toward the voices. Then I saw them. Julian and Margaret sat together beside the fireplace, drinking wine from crystal glasses taken from my private collection. A bottle from my cellar, one worth thousands of dollars, was open on the table between them. Margaret lounged comfortably against the white leather sofa, while Julian leaned back in his chair, looking almost peaceful. They weren't grieving. They weren't nervous. They were celebrating my death. To Audrey, Julian said, with a smirk, raising his glass lazily. May she rest in peace at the bottom of the Atlantic. Margaret laughed sharply, the exact same cruel laugh I heard echoing across the ocean while I fought for my life. You know, she said, swirling her wine, I genuinely worried you'd lose your nerve. You always were too soft where women are concerned. Julian chuckled under his breath. Turns out it was easier than I expected. She trusted me completely, didn't even suspect anything. He shook his head in amusement. Honestly, it's almost embarrassing how predictable she was. Women like Audrey always are, Margaret replied coldly. Self-made women are desperate to prove they can have it all. Power, money, love. They become blinded by the fantasy. All you had to do was make her feel special long enough for her to hand you access to everything. Julian smirked. And now everything she built belongs to us. I stood frozen in the darkness just outside the room, listening as the last pieces of my marriage disintegrated forever. Every word felt like another knife sliding deeper into my chest. Not because I still loved Julian, I realized now that version of him never truly existed, but because hearing them speak so casually about my death revealed just how little my life had ever meant to them. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her eyes glittering with greed. The moment the death certificate is finalized, we begin phase 2. You'll publicly play the devastated widower for 6 months, maybe a year. Long enough to gain sympathy from the board and investors. Then we slowly liquidate the company assets and move the capital offshore. Julian nodded. By the time federal auditors notice anything missing, we'll already be gone. Switzerland, maybe. Or Dubai. Smart boy, Margaret purred proudly. Your father never understood how the world really works. Wealth isn't built through morality. It's taken by people willing to do what others are too weak to stomach. That sentence snapped something inside me. I stepped into the room slowly, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Interesting philosophy, I said calmly. Unfortunately for both of you, your execution was sloppy. The reaction was instant and almost surreal. Julian's entire body jerked violently backward as if he had seen an actual ghost. His wineglass slipped from his fingers and shattered across the floor, red liquid splashing like blood across the polished wood. Margaret's face drained of color so quickly she looked corpse-like under the chandelier light. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. They simply stared at me in absolute horror. Audrey, Julian whispered, finally his voice cracking. That's impossible. I tilted my head slightly. You should have made sure I was dead before celebrating. Margaret recovered first, though I could see panic flickering behind her eyes. This is insane, she snapped, standing abruptly. You fell overboard. Julian tried to save you. Really, I interrupted smoothly. That's interesting because the yacht GPS says otherwise. I pulled a folder from beneath my arm and tossed it onto the glass coffee table. It also appears your son disabled the onboard cameras 37 minutes before I conveniently fell. Very unfortunate timing. Julian stumbled backward, breathing hard. Audrey, listen to me. No, I cut him off sharply. You listen. I stepped closer, my voice low and deadly calm. I know about the shell companies, the offshore accounts, the forged probate documents, the embezzled millions. I know Margaret built the structure and you helped move the money. I know this entire marriage was a setup designed to steal my empire. Margaret's composure cracked instantly. You paranoid little bitch, she hissed venomously. You have no proof. I smiled coldly and slowly lifted the recorder from my pocket. Actually, I do, including the last 5 minutes of this conversation. Julian's face completely collapsed. The color vanished from his skin while terror flooded his eyes. He realized it all at once, the recordings, the financial evidence, the GPS tracking the frozen accounts. Their perfect plan had just detonated in front of them. You set us up, he whispered weakly. No, I replied. You set yourselves up the moment you decided to throw me into the ocean. Margaret suddenly lunged forward in fury. You think you've won, she screamed. You are nothing without that company. Nothing. You were just another desperate nobody before my son made you respectable. I stared at her with complete disgust. That's the difference between us, Margaret. I built my empire with intelligence and work. You built yours through manipulation, theft, and murder. The word murder hung heavily in the air. Julian looked like he might collapse entirely. Then before either of them could say another word, the front doors exploded open behind me. Armed FBI agents flooded into the mansion, shouting commands while red and blue lights flashed violently through the glass walls. Renee entered beside them, calm and composed as always, her eyes immediately locking onto Julian and Margaret. Julian Kensington. Margaret Kensington, you are under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, financial embezzlement, and money laundering. Julian didn't resist. He simply sank to his knees, looking completely destroyed, while agents dragged his arms behind his back and locked him into handcuffs. Margaret, however, erupted into pure rage. She screamed obscenities, fought the agents physically, and pointed at me with shaking fingers as they restrained her. "This is your fault," she shrieked hysterically. "You should have died when you had the chance." The entire room fell silent for one devastating second after those words left her mouth. Even the agents paused. Margaret realized too late what she had just admitted. I looked directly into her furious eyes, while the FBI pulled her toward the door. "Thank you," I said softly. "That confession will look excellent in court." As they dragged both of them out into the flashing lights of the waiting federal vehicles, Julian turned back toward me one final time. The expression on his face wasn't love, guilt, or even hatred anymore. It was fear, pure, helpless fear. And for the first time since I hit that freezing water, I finally felt like I could breathe again. I thought surviving the ocean would be the hardest part. I was wrong. The moment Julian and Margaret were arrested, the story exploded across every major news network in the country. At first, public sympathy leaned heavily in my favor. Headlines called me the billionaire CEO who survived an attempted murder at sea, and reporters camped outside my gates 24 hours a day, hoping to capture footage of the woman who came back from the dead. But Margaret Kensington had spent decades mastering manipulation, and even from behind bars, she knew exactly how to weaponize public perception. 2 days after her arrest, she made bail through hidden offshore reserves we hadn't yet frozen, and the second she walked out of federal custody, she launched a media offensive so vicious it nearly destroyed me, standing in front of cameras outside the courthouse dressed in immaculate white, like some grieving aristocrat. Margaret looked directly into the microphones and calmly declared that I was mentally unstable, obsessive, and dangerously controlling. She claimed Julian had been trapped in an emotionally abusive marriage for years, and that I fabricated the entire murder story after he threatened to leave me. "Audrey is a deeply disturbed woman," Margaret told reporters, with heartbreaking sincerity, carefully crafted for television. "She is brilliant in business, but emotionally volatile. My son tried to help her for years. This tragedy is the result of her paranoia and instability." Within hours, the media narrative started shifting. News panels debated whether I had exaggerated the attack. Social media exploded with conspiracy theories, claiming I staged the yacht incident for publicity or corporate advantage. Some commentators questioned why there were no bruises from the push. Others suggested I manipulated the FBI using my wealth and political influence. A former rival CEO appeared on a business network calling me a narcissistic billionaire with a history of destroying anyone who challenged her. Anonymous online accounts flooded every article about me with accusations that I was vindictive, mentally ill, and power-hungry. The hatred spread faster than I could contain it. Paparazzi surrounded my mansion day and night, screaming invasive questions through security gates every time I stepped outside. "Did you fake your own murder attempt? Are you framing your husband? Were you abusing Julian?" The noise became relentless. Cruel headlines appeared daily beside giant photographs of my face, billionaire wife, or master manipulator survivor, or sociopath. The worst part wasn't the reporters. It was the uncertainty slowly infecting the public. Margaret understood something terrifying about people. If you repeat a lie confidently enough, eventually somebody wants to believe it. Then the threats started arriving. At first, they came through anonymous emails and burner accounts online. People told me I deserved to drown. Some claimed Julian should have finished the job. Others promised they would. Renee intercepted dozens of credible threats within the first week alone. One message included photographs of my daily routine taken from outside my office building. Another contained satellite images of my house with the words, "Next time you won't survive." Federal agents increased my security immediately, but the fear still crawled beneath my skin every waking second. I stopped sleeping properly. Every sound outside the mansion made my pulse spike. Even surrounded by guards and cameras, I no longer felt safe inside my own home. Margaret had managed to do what the ocean could not, make me feel trapped, isolated, and hunted. The pressure began infecting my professional life as well. Investors demanded emergency meetings. Corporate analysts questioned whether the scandal would destabilize my company long term. Several senior executives privately suggested I should step down temporarily for optics. That hurt more than I expected. I had built the company from nothing with my own hands, sacrificing relationships, sleep, and years of my life to create something revolutionary. Yet now, after surviving attempted murder, people still questioned whether I was the problem. Valerie tried to shield me from the worst of it, but I could see the strain even on her face during board meetings. Gregory warned me the defense team was deliberately poisoning public opinion before trial to influence potential jurors. Renee traced several smear campaigns back to dark money public relations firms connected to Margaret's offshore networks. Even facing federal charges, she was still orchestrating attacks with terrifying precision. She wasn't trying to win sympathy anymore. She was trying to destroy my credibility completely. One night, unable to sleep, I stood alone in the kitchen, staring out at the flashing camera lights beyond my security gates. The reflection in the glass barely looked like me anymore. My eyes were hollow from exhaustion, my shoulders constantly tense. For the first time since surviving the attack, doubt began creeping into my mind. Not doubt about what happened, I knew exactly what Julian and Margaret had done, but doubt about people, about trust, about whether anyone truly saw me as human beyond the headlines, the money, the spectacle. I had survived betrayal, attempted murder, and corporate warfare, yet somehow this felt worse because it attacked something deeper than my body. It attacked my identity. Margaret was trying to erase me psychologically, to turn me into a caricature the world would despise before the trial even began. And the terrifying part was that she was succeeding. Renee found me standing there just before dawn, still watching the reporters outside. "You need to stop reading the coverage," she said quietly. I let out a bitter laugh. Hard to ignore when they've practically built a city outside my front gate. She studied me carefully before speaking again. "Margaret knows she can't beat the evidence, so she's trying to break you emotionally before court." I crossed my arms tightly against the cold marble counter. "What if it works?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. Renee's expression hardened instantly. "Then she wins. And people like her only win when everyone else gets too exhausted to keep fighting." I looked back toward the swarm of cameras beyond the gates and realized something painful but necessary. Surviving the ocean hadn't ended the war. It had only started it, because being alive didn't mean I had won yet, not even close. Renee delivered the files at 2:17 inches the morning. 3 heavy banker boxes slammed onto the marble dining table beside an encrypted laptop filled with enough evidence to destroy governments. I stared at the mountain of documents while rain hammered against the glass walls of my mansion, casting reflections across the room like prison bars. Renee looked exhausted but intensely focused, her dark eyes carrying the cold adrenaline of someone who had just uncovered something far bigger than expected. "Your mother-in-law," she said, quietly sliding the first folder toward me, "is not just a manipulative socialite. Margaret Kensington is the head of a criminal enterprise." For a second, I genuinely thought she was exaggerating. Then I opened the folder. Inside were decades of financial transfers, shell corporations, offshore trusts, bribery ledgers, and coded communications linking Margaret to fraud operations spread across multiple states and several foreign accounts. The scale was staggering. It wasn't random corruption or isolated greed. It was organized, structured, ruthlessly professional. Margaret had spent 30 years building a hidden empire beneath the polished mask of a high society philanthropist. Every gala, every charity foundation, every smiling photograph in magazines had been camouflage for a criminal machine worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Renee began walking me through the evidence piece by piece, like a homicide detective explaining a serial killer's pattern. Margaret controlled at least 19 shell companies spread through the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, and Panama. On paper, they appeared to be harmless consulting firms, charitable investment groups, or estate management corporations. In reality, they were laundering stolen money from fraudulent trusts, manipulated inheritances, fake insurance claims, and embezzled charity funds. Elderly victims lost retirement savings after Margaret convinced them to place assets under foundations she secretly controlled. Wealthy widows disappeared from financial records after trusting her with estate planning. Judges received luxury vacations and untraceable cash transfers in exchange for dismissing investigations. State politicians accepted donations routed through intermediaries to protect her business interests. Renee had traced payments to 2 senators, a federal prosecutor, and multiple banking executives. "This isn't white-collar greed anymore," she said grimly. "This is RICO territory. Organized crime with political protection." The words made my stomach tighten. I had spent years fighting hostile corporate takeovers and ruthless investors, but this was something else entirely. Margaret wasn't just corrupt. She operated like a mafia strategist wearing designer pearls. Then Renee opened the second folder and everything became darker. "Let's talk about Arthur Kensington," she said. "Julian's father. Officially, he died 10 years earlier from sudden cardiac failure at age 58. I remembered Margaret speaking about him with carefully rehearsed grief during family dinners, always presenting herself as the tragic widow, carrying the burden of old money and family legacy. Renee slid the autopsy report across the table. "Arthur had no history of heart disease," she explained. "No arterial blockages, no major risk factors, perfect medical evaluations 6 months before death." My eyes scanned the report while ice slowly spread through my chest. "Then how did he die?" Renee turned the laptop toward me, displaying toxicology notes hidden deep within archived medical records. "Poison." The word hung in the room like smoke. According to Renee's investigation, Margaret had slowly administered a rare toxin over several months. One almost impossible to detect because it perfectly mimicked natural cardiac failure. The physician who signed the death certificate was an old private doctor whose medical license had nearly been revoked years earlier for falsifying patient records. Margaret had blackmailed him into silence using evidence connected to malpractice lawsuits. "Arthur was planning to cut her out of the estate," Renee said, handing me another document. It was a draft of a revised will. Most of the Kensington fortune would have gone into protected trusts for Julian and his sister Lauren, leaving Margaret with only a controlled allowance. The revised will disappeared before probate. 2 weeks later, the estate lawyer who drafted it died in what police ruled a tragic single-car accident on a wet highway. Renee looked me directly in the eyes. "Your mother-in-law almost certainly had both men killed." I felt physically sick. But Renee wasn't finished. "There's more," she said quietly, opening the final folder. Across the tab was one name written in black marker: Lauren Kensington. Julian's younger sister had supposedly vanished years ago after suffering what Margaret described as a mental breakdown. I vaguely remembered hearing the story during my engagement. Margaret claimed Lauren became unstable after Arthur's death and disappeared voluntarily to find herself. No one ever questioned it publicly. According to Renee's investigation, that story was a lie. Lauren had been a school teacher in Asheville, North Carolina. Intelligent, independent, financially responsible. After Arthur died, she started investigating inconsistencies in family accounts and confronted Margaret directly. Friends reported explosive arguments between them during the funeral period. Lauren believed her father had been manipulated and financially drained before his death. She threatened legal action over the inheritance. 6 months later, she vanished. Her apartment remained untouched. Her car was abandoned on the street. Her bank accounts froze permanently. No travel records, no passport activity, no credit card usage. Nothing. "People don't disappear that completely unless they're dead," Renee said flatly. My throat tightened. "You think Margaret murdered her own daughter?" Renee's silence answered, before her words did. "I think Lauren became a liability." The deeper Renee dug, the more horrifying the pattern became. Margaret didn't kill impulsively. She eliminated threats strategically. Anyone who endangered her control, money, or reputation eventually suffered financial ruin, disappearance, or highly convenient death. Renee uncovered suspicious links to at least 6 unresolved fatalities connected to Margaret's financial network over 2 decades. One investor supposedly drowned during a yacht accident after threatening litigation. A charity accountant died from an alleged overdose shortly before testifying in a fraud inquiry. A retired judge suffered a fatal fall days after reopening a corruption case involving one of Margaret's shell foundations. None of it had been conclusively tied to her at the time because Margaret understood insulation better than most intelligence agencies. She never touched anything directly. Every order moved through lawyers, fixers, offshore intermediaries, or compromised officials. People working for her often had no idea who they were truly serving. She built layers upon layers of separation between herself and the crimes. It was brilliant, in a horrifying way. "She's a sociopath," Renee said while scrolling through encrypted banking trails. "Highly intelligent, no empathy, extreme narcissism. She sees human beings as assets or obstacles, nothing else." I sat there in stunned silence while the reality slowly settled over me. Margaret Kensington wasn't merely the cruel mother-in-law who hated me for being self-made. She was a lifelong predator who weaponized wealth, class, and reputation to hide a criminal empire in plain sight. And Julian had grown up inside it. Suddenly, his fear of her made terrifying sense. Every strange tension in their relationship, every nervous glance, every desperate need for approval, it all connected differently now. He hadn't simply been manipulated. He had been raised by a woman capable of orchestrating murders without remorse. That realization didn't excuse what he did to me, but it transformed the scale of the nightmare entirely. I wasn't fighting against greedy relatives anymore. I was fighting against a dynasty built on fraud, corruption, extortion, and blood. Renee finally closed the final folder and leaned back in her chair. "This is bigger than your attempted murder," she said. "Much bigger. If we expose all of this, we're not just taking down Margaret. We're detonating an entire network of politicians, bankers, attorneys, and corrupt officials tied to her operation." Rain continued crashing against the windows while I stared at the evidence scattered across the table. My marriage had started feeling like a betrayal. Now it felt like infiltration. Margaret had selected me because I was wealthy, powerful, and useful. Julian had been deployed into my life like a long-term asset in one of her operations. Every smile, every romantic vacation, every whispered promise suddenly felt contaminated by strategy. The woman who laughed while I drowned in the Atlantic wasn't acting out of emotion. She was executing another transaction, another obstacle removed, another fortune absorbed into her empire. For the first time since surviving the yacht, I understood the true scale of what I was facing. Margaret Kensington was not simply evil in the ordinary sense. She was something colder, more methodical, a predator refined by decades of success and protected by power at every level of society. And if we failed to destroy her completely, she would keep killing forever. The meeting took place inside a heavily secured federal detention facility 3 weeks after Julian's arrest. Gregory arranged it through the FBI after Julian's attorney contacted us with an offer that immediately raised every alarm in my mind. Julian was willing to cooperate fully against Margaret Kensington in exchange for a reduced sentence and placement into federal witness protection. At first I refused outright. The idea of helping the man who had shoved me into the Atlantic Ocean made my skin crawl. But Renee insisted we hear him out. If Margaret really built an organized criminal network, she told me, then Julian is the closest thing we have to an insider witness. He grew up inside that machine. He knows where the bodies are buried. The phrase turned out to be disturbingly literal. The prison conference room smelled faintly of bleach and stale air conditioning. Thick reinforced glass covered the narrow windows, and an armed correctional officer stood outside the steel door the entire time. Renee remained beside me while Gregory sat across the table with a legal pad prepared to document every word. Then the guards brought Julian in wearing an orange prison jumpsuit and handcuffs connected to a waist chain. For a moment I barely recognized him. The man who once wore tailored Italian suits and smiled confidently beside me at charity galas now looked hollowed out and exhausted. Dark bruises sat beneath his eyes. His skin looked pale and sickly under the fluorescent lights. Prison had stripped away every layer of charm and polish he once hid behind. When he finally looked at me, his expression collapsed completely. Shame, fear, desperation, maybe even grief. I felt none of it in return. The ocean had burned all softness out of me. "You wanted to talk," I said coldly before he could speak. "So, talk." Julian swallowed hard. His shackles rattled slightly as he shifted in the chair. "Audrey, I know you hate me. Hate would imply I still care enough to feel something for you." The words hit him like a slap. His face tightened, but he nodded as if he deserved it. "Fair," he whispered. For several seconds, silence stretched between us like broken glass. Finally, he took a shaky breath. "I need you to understand something. I never should have done what I did to you. I know that now. I stared at him without expression. You realized attempted murder was wrong after getting arrested. Julian flinched visibly. I'm serious. So am I. My voice sharpened. You pushed your wife into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and watched me drown. You whispered in my ear before you did it. You don't get redemption because prison suddenly became uncomfortable. Julian lowered his eyes to the table. You think I don't replay it every second of every day? He asked hoarsely. I see your face every time I close my eyes. The shock, the betrayal. I hear you screaming in the water. Good, I said immediately. You should. His jaw tightened, and for the first time since entering the room, genuine emotion cracked through the numbness in his expression. You think I'm asking for forgiveness? I know I don't deserve it. I'm trying to survive. That finally caught my attention. Renee crossed her arms beside me while Gregory leaned slightly forward. Julian looked toward the door instinctively before lowering his voice. My mother knows I'm talking to the FBI. And I asked flatly. Fear flickered openly across his face now. Real fear. Animal fear. And if I don't get federal protection, she'll have me killed before trial. The room went silent. Julian leaned forward against his chains, speaking faster now as though he'd finally crossed a line he could never uncross. You don't understand what she is, Audrey. Not fully. She's not just manipulative. She's dangerous in ways people can't imagine. My entire life was controlled by her. Every friendship, every relationship, every decision. His breathing became uneven. When my father started questioning her finances, he got sick 3 months later. My pulse slowed dangerously. You knew she poisoned him. Julian closed his eyes briefly. Not at first. But after he died, I found letters between her and the doctor. Payments, instructions. She made it look like heart disease. Gregory immediately started writing faster while Renee's expression hardened. And Lauren? She asked sharply. Julian's entire body stiffened. For the first time, he genuinely looked shattered. Lauren figured it out, he whispered. She confronted my mother after the funeral. Said she was going to the police. He swallowed painfully. 6 months later, she disappeared. I stared at him in disbelief. You helped cover it up. He nodded slowly, tears filling his eyes. I was terrified of her. Rage exploded through me so suddenly I nearly stood up. You were terrified, I snapped. She murdered your father and your sister, and your response was to help her kill me too. I know, Julian shouted back before immediately shrinking under the weight of his own outburst. I know what I became. The room fell silent again except for the distant echo of prison doors slamming somewhere down the corridor. Julian lowered his voice to almost nothing. I spent my entire life trying to survive her. That doesn't excuse anything. But it's the truth. I looked at him carefully, searching for manipulation. Maybe some of it was calculated. Maybe some of it was self-preservation. But underneath the fear, there was something else too. Exhaustion. Like a man who had spent decades drowning long before he threw me into the ocean. What exactly are you offering? Gregory finally asked. Julian looked toward him, immediately grateful for the shift away from emotion. Evidence. Everything. Be specific, Renee demanded. Julian nodded quickly. I kept backups for years. Hidden drives. Financial ledgers. Audio recordings. Insurance in case my mother ever decided I was disposable. Gregory's pen stopped moving. Audio recordings. She liked talking, Julian said bitterly. She liked reminding people how untouchable she was. He looked back at me. I have recordings of her discussing bribes, laundering operations, judges she paid off, fake charities she used to move money offshore. His voice dropped further. And I have a recording of her admitting she ordered Lauren killed. Even Renee looked stunned by that. Julian continued before anyone interrupted. I also know where Lauren's body is buried. Rural Georgia. My mother hired 2 men to dispose of her. I have coordinates. A heavy silence settled over the room. This was no longer just about my attempted murder. This was a federal nightmare involving organized crime, corruption, and multiple homicides. Gregory slowly closed his notebook. If this evidence is legitimate, he said carefully, your mother is finished. Julian gave a hollow laugh. She should have been finished decades ago. I studied him for a long moment. This man had betrayed me in the most unforgivable way imaginable. Yet now he sat chained to a prison table, offering to destroy the woman who created him. Why now? I finally asked quietly. Because she was eventually going to kill me too, he admitted. That's what she does. Once someone becomes a liability, she removes them. He looked directly into my eyes, then his expression raw and broken. You survived, Audrey. Nobody survives her. When I saw you walk back into that house alive, I realized she wasn't invincible anymore. I felt absolutely nothing hearing that. No satisfaction, no pity, just cold clarity. Julian wasn't confessing because morality suddenly found him. He was confessing because survival instinct finally outweighed loyalty. Gregory broke the silence first. The FBI can potentially negotiate reduced sentencing if your cooperation leads to major convictions, but witness protection isn't guaranteed. Julian looked panicked instantly. It has to be guaranteed. That depends on the value of your evidence, Renee replied sharply. Julian shook his head desperately. You don't understand. If my mother has people left on the outside, they'll kill me. I leaned back slowly in my chair, studying him one final time. Then give us everything, I said coldly. Every recording, every ledger, every buried secret. Help us bury Margaret permanently, and maybe the government decides you're worth keeping alive. Julian nodded immediately. Done. As the guards came to escort him away, he paused at the doorway and looked back at me one last time. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I did love you once. The words hung in the room for a second before I answered, and yet you still tried to murder me. Julian lowered his eyes, unable to argue. Then the guards pulled him through the steel door, and he disappeared back into the concrete machinery of federal prison. Renee exhaled slowly beside me. Do you believe him? She asked. I stared at the empty doorway for a long moment before answering. I believe he's terrified, I said. And terrified people are usually the ones who finally tell the truth. The federal trial began on a suffocating Monday morning in downtown Miami beneath a storm of flashing cameras, satellite news, vans, and crowds packed behind police barricades. Reporters shouted questions the moment I stepped out of the armored SUV with Renee beside me. Some called me a survivor. Others still questioned whether I had manipulated the entire investigation. The case had become a national obsession, a billionaire biotech CEO nearly murdered by her husband. A high society matriarch accused of running a criminal empire, multiple buried homicides, political corruption, money laundering, bribery, racketeering. It sounded less like reality and more like a prestige crime thriller, except every horrifying detail was real. Federal marshals escorted us through the courthouse while protesters screamed on both sides of the entrance. Some held signs demanding justice for Lauren Kensington and the victims of Margaret's fraud schemes. Others bizarrely defended Margaret, convinced she was the target of a political witch hunt orchestrated by a powerful billionaire. The atmosphere felt radioactive before the trial even began. Inside courtroom 7B, the tension was almost physical. The gallery overflowed with journalists, legal analysts, wealthy socialites, former victims of Margaret's schemes, and curious spectators desperate to witness the downfall of one of Miami's most untouchable women. Margaret sat at the defense table in a perfectly tailored navy suit, her silver hair immaculate, her posture rigid with aristocratic superiority. She looked less like a criminal defendant and more like a senator attending a fundraiser. Only her eyes betrayed anything darker. When she saw me enter the courtroom, pure hatred flickered across her face for a fraction of a second before vanishing behind practiced composure. Beside her sat Donovan Pierce, one of the most feared defense attorneys in the country, a man famous for dismantling federal prosecutions and rescuing corrupt executives from prison. Across from them stood Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Sanchez, the lead prosecutor. Methodical and relentless, with a reputation for destroying organized crime networks. This wasn't merely a murder trial anymore. It was a war between power structures. Sanchez opened the government's case with devastating precision. He walked the jury through decades of corruption while giant digital screens displayed timelines, shell corporations, offshore transfers, bribery records, and homicide evidence. The defendant, Sanchez said calmly, did not simply commit isolated crimes. Margaret Kensington constructed a criminal enterprise hidden beneath wealth, philanthropy, and social prestige. She manipulated institutions, corrupted officials, orchestrated murders, and weaponized her own family for profit. The courtroom remained completely silent, except for the clicking of reporters' keyboards. Sanchez outlined the prosecution's core allegations, one by one: the poisoning of Arthur Kensington, the disappearance and murder of Lauren Kensington, the embezzlement schemes, the offshore laundering operations, the bribed officials, finally the attempted murder of me aboard the yacht. Then came the line that shifted the room entirely. "The government will prove," Sanchez stated, staring directly toward the jury box, "that Margaret Kensington ordered her own son to murder his wife for financial gain." Even after everything I already knew, hearing it spoken aloud in federal court sent a chill through my spine. Donovan's defense strategy was aggressive from the beginning. He painted Margaret as the victim of a coordinated character assassination orchestrated by a vindictive billionaire and a desperate son trying to reduce his sentence. He repeatedly attacked Julian's credibility, reminding the jury that he accepted a plea agreement in exchange for testimony. He described me as an emotionally unstable corporate titan, obsessed with control. At one point, he even implied I fabricated portions of the attack to consolidate sympathy and corporate power. The accusations were infuriating, but Gregory warned me beforehand this would happen. Donovan's job wasn't to prove Margaret innocent. It was to create enough doubt to fracture the prosecution's narrative. And he was extremely good at it. For the first few days, the courtroom felt like a psychological battlefield where truth itself became distorted under pressure. Then the evidence started landing like artillery. FBI forensic accountants testified for nearly 2 full days, explaining how Margaret's network of shell corporations moved hundreds of millions of dollars through offshore havens while concealing fraudulent trusts and embezzled charity funds. Complex financial diagrams filled enormous screens while jurors stared in stunned silence. One analyst detailed how Margaret siphoned retirement accounts from elderly victims through manipulated estate vehicles disguised as philanthropic investment programs. Another demonstrated how luxury properties in Manhattan, Switzerland, and the Cayman Islands were purchased through laundering chains connected directly to Margaret's foundations. The defense tried challenging the accounting methods, but the paper trail was overwhelming. Every hidden account led back to her. Every fraudulent transfer intersected with one of her controlled entities. It became painfully clear Margaret had operated like the head of a corporate crime syndicate for decades. The forensic testimony regarding Arthur and Lauren was even worse. Medical experts testified that Arthur Kensington's toxicology patterns matched long-term poisoning using a rare synthetic compound engineered to imitate natural heart failure. The disgraced doctor who falsified the death certificate took the stand, visibly trembling. Under oath, he admitted Margaret blackmailed him with evidence of past malpractice lawsuits and paid him to conceal the murder. Gasps spread through the courtroom when he described Margaret calmly discussing dosage schedules weeks before Arthur died. Then came Lauren. FBI investigators described discovering her remains buried in rural Georgia, exactly where Julian's coordinates indicated. A forensic anthropologist testified Lauren had been strangled before burial, while chemical analysis confirmed industrial lye had been poured over the body to accelerate decomposition. The courtroom became so emotionally charged during that testimony that one juror quietly cried while listening. Margaret never reacted. She simply sat motionless, hands folded neatly in front of her like a statue carved from ice. That terrified me more than any outburst could have. Julian testified on the 12th day of trial. The entire courtroom shifted the moment federal marshals escorted him to the witness stand in prison restraints. Media cameras practically exploded with flashes. He looked thinner than ever, exhausted and visibly terrified, but when he finally raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth, the room became deathly silent. Sanchez guided him carefully through his childhood under Margaret's control. Julian described years of emotional manipulation, fear, isolation, and psychological abuse. He admitted helping launder money and conceal fraud operations under his mother's direction. Then Sanchez asked the question everyone had been waiting for. "Did the defendant instruct you to murder Audrey Kensington?" Julian's face collapsed completely. For several seconds he couldn't speak. Then he nodded. "Yes," he whispered. A wave of whispers rippled through the courtroom. Sanchez pressed further. "Tell the jury exactly what happened on the yacht." Julian closed his eyes briefly before answering. "My mother planned the entire trip. She told me Audrey trusted me completely and this was our only chance." His voice shook violently now. She coached me on where to push her so there wouldn't be obvious bruising if they recovered the body. She told me what to say beforehand. Then, I pushed my wife into the ocean. The courtroom fell silent except for Julian quietly breaking apart on the witness stand. He described hearing me scream in the water while Margaret laughed beside him on the deck. Several jurors looked horrified. One woman in the front row visibly wiped tears from her face. Donovan's cross-examination was brutal. He attacked Julian as a selfish coward willing to blame his mother to save himself from life imprisonment. "You expect this jury to believe you suddenly grew a conscience," Donovan sneered. Julian looked directly at him. "No," he answered quietly. "I expect them to believe I was weak enough to become exactly what my mother raised me to be." It was the first truly honest thing I had ever heard him say. Donovan tried dismantling him further, but the recordings destroyed any remaining ambiguity. Prosecutors played audio tapes Julian secretly collected over the years. Margaret's voice echoed through the courtroom, discussing bribery payments, fraudulent foundations, and most damningly, Lauren's death. "She became a problem," Margaret said coldly on one recording. "Problems must be handled permanently." Even Donovan looked rattled hearing it. I testified during the third week of trial. Walking past Margaret toward the witness stand felt surreal. This woman had tried to erase me from existence, and now I was helping dismantle her empire piece by piece under oath. Sanchez asked me to describe the yacht incident in detail. I spoke calmly about the freezing water, the panic, the engines fading into the distance while I fought to stay alive. Then he asked what I remembered most clearly. I looked directly at the jury before answering. "The laughter," I said quietly. Margaret laughing while I drowned. The room went completely still. Donovan tried portraying me as vindictive during cross-examination, but every attempt collapsed beneath the evidence. GPS tracking from the yacht showed deliberate deviation from course. Audio recordings captured Julian and Margaret celebrating my death inside my own living room hours later. Financial documents proved they prepared to seize my assets immediately after my disappearance. No amount of courtroom theatrics could erase facts that overwhelming. By the time closing arguments arrived, the defense looked exhausted. Sanchez spent nearly 4 hours methodically reconstructing Margaret's criminal empire for the jury. Every fraud scheme, every bribery payment, every murder, every manipulated person left destroyed in her wake. Margaret Kensington believed wealth made her untouchable, he concluded. She believed power meant she could decide who lived, who died, and who disappeared. But this courtroom proves otherwise. Donovan gave a passionate final argument about reasonable doubt, government overreach, and unreliable witnesses, but the momentum was gone. The evidence had become too massive, too interconnected, too horrifying to dismiss. As the jury left for deliberation, I finally allowed myself to breathe for the first time in months. Everything that happened since the yacht, the fear, the betrayal, the investigations, the media war, the threats had led to this room. This trial was the reckoning for all of it. Margaret Kensington sat motionless at the defense table as the courtroom fell into a suffocating silence, the kind that only existed in the seconds before lives were permanently destroyed. Reporters lined every row with pens frozen above notebooks, cameras aimed like weapons at the woman who had once ruled Miami's elite circles with flawless elegance and terrifying precision. Audrey stood beside Renee near the back of the federal courtroom, her pulse hammering against her ribs while 12 jurors prepared to decide whether Margaret would spend the rest of her life behind bars. Judge Carmichael nodded toward the jury foreperson. "Read the verdict." The foreperson unfolded the papers with trembling hands. On the charge of attempted first-degree murder against Audrey Kensington, he paused. Margaret's jaw tightened, though she still carried herself with the rigid arrogance of someone convinced the world could never truly punish her. "We find the defendant guilty." A wave of whispers exploded across the courtroom. Julian lowered his head instantly, eyes shut in silent defeat. Margaret barely reacted, but Audrey saw the first crack appear in the older woman's icy composure. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Lauren Kensington, the four-person continued voice stronger, "Now guilty." A sharp gasp echoed from the gallery. Lauren's former co-workers began crying openly while reporters scribbled furiously. Margaret's fingers dug into the edge of the defense table so hard her knuckles turned white. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Arthur Kensington, guilty. The words slammed into the room like a hammer. One guilty verdict after another followed in brutal succession: wire fraud, racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, embezzlement, bribery. 23 federal charges. 23 convictions. By the end, Margaret no longer looked untouchable. She looked cornered, broken, exposed. Her expensive navy suit and perfect silver hair could no longer hide what she truly was. A predator who had finally run out of places to hide. Then suddenly the mask shattered completely. Margaret surged to her feet with wild fury twisting across her face. "This is a lie," she screamed at Audrey, her voice cracking through the courtroom. "You ruined my family. You should have drowned in that ocean exactly like you were supposed to." Federal marshals rushed forward instantly as chaos erupted around the gallery. Margaret lunged toward Audrey before officers slammed her against the defense table and forced her into handcuffs. Cameras flashed violently from every direction while journalists shouted questions over one another. Audrey didn't move. She simply watched as the woman who had orchestrated murders, stolen fortunes, and manipulated entire systems finally lost control in front of the entire nation. 2 weeks later, the sentencing hearing sealed Margaret's fate forever. Victims filled the courtroom describing destroyed pensions, stolen inheritances, shattered families, and lives ruined by her greed. Audrey gave her statement calmly describing the freezing Atlantic water, the terror of watching the yacht disappear into darkness, and the unbearable realization that her own husband had tried to murder her for money. Margaret showed no remorse, even at the end. She stood before the judge with cold defiance burning in her eyes. "I will not apologize for being ambitious," she declared bitterly. "Everything I did was to protect my family and my legacy." Judge Carmichael stared down at her without emotion. "Margaret Kensington, you are one of the most dangerous individuals this court has ever encountered. You orchestrated murders, corruption, fraud, and psychological manipulation on a massive scale while hiding behind wealth and social status. You have shown absolutely no remorse for the devastation you caused." The judge's voice hardened like steel. "For the murders of Arthur and Lauren Kensington, I sentence you to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Additional sentences for racketeering, fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder will run consecutively. You will spend the remainder of your natural life in federal prison." The words hit Margaret harder than any scream could have. For the first time since Audrey met her, the older woman looked genuinely afraid. Not angry, not manipulative, afraid. Marshals chained her wrists and led her out of the courtroom while reporters rushed toward the exits to broadcast the historic sentence nationwide. Margaret never looked back. Julian's sentencing came a month later. He entered the courtroom thinner, exhausted, and hollow-eyed after months in federal custody. His testimony and cooperation with the FBI had dismantled Margaret's criminal empire completely, but it did not erase what he had done. The judge acknowledged his assistance while reminding the court that Julian had still shoved his wife into the Atlantic Ocean and left her there to die. "You made a conscious choice to commit attempted murder," Judge Carmichael said firmly. "Fear of your mother does not absolve you of responsibility." Julian received 15 years in federal prison under the plea agreement. He accepted the sentence quietly, almost numbly, as if part of him believed he deserved far worse. Audrey watched him get led away in chains and felt nothing at all. No hatred, no love, no satisfaction, just emptiness. Outside the courthouse, prosecutors announced that the federal government had seized Margaret's mansion's offshore accounts, luxury vehicles, shell corporations, and hidden assets under RICO statutes. Hundreds of millions of dollars would now be redirected toward compensating victims of her fraud schemes. Her empire was gone. Her influence was gone. Her name had become synonymous with corruption and murder. Audrey stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by microphones and cameras as the entire nation waited for her reaction. The warm Miami wind brushed against her face while flashes exploded around her. "Justice was served today," she said steadily. Margaret Kensington spent decades believing wealth and power placed her above consequences. She was wrong. She paused briefly, remembering the icy Atlantic water closing over her head and the sound of Margaret laughing from the yacht. "They tried to destroy my life for greed. Instead, the truth destroyed them." A year after the trial ended, Audrey stood on the deck of a brand new yacht, cutting through the calm Atlantic waters just beyond the Miami coastline. The wind carried the scent of salt and summer across the open deck, while the setting sun painted the horizon in streaks of gold and crimson. Renee leaned against the railing nearby. Gregory sat with a glass of champagne, reviewing acquisition reports on his tablet. And Valerie animatedly explained the company's newest oncology breakthrough with the same fierce brilliance that had helped them build their biotech empire from nothing. Everything around Audrey felt different now, stronger, cleaner. The fear that once lived permanently beneath her skin had finally begun to loosen its grip. The nightmares still came, sometimes freezing black water, Julian's hands against her back. Margaret's laughter echoing over crashing waves, but they no longer controlled her life. Therapy, time, and survival had carved something new inside her. Not innocence. That part of her was gone forever, but resilience. Wisdom, a ruthless understanding of her own worth. In the years following the trial, Audrey's company expanded internationally, becoming one of the most influential biotech corporations in the world. Their laboratories developed revolutionary cancer treatments, rare disease therapies, and medical technologies that saved countless lives. Investors called her unstoppable. Business magazines labeled her the woman who survived death and built an empire anyway. Competitors feared her. Boards respected her. Employees admired her loyalty and terrifying precision under pressure. But Audrey no longer measured success through headlines or market valuations alone. Surviving had fundamentally changed her understanding of power. Real power was not yash, mansions, or billion-dollar valuations. Real power was standing back up after betrayal should have destroyed you. Real power was surviving the people who tried to erase you and refusing to let them poison your future. She never remarried. The thought of giving someone that level of trust again felt impossible, maybe even unnecessary. Instead, she built a life around the people who had proven themselves when everything collapsed. Valerie, Renee, Gregory, and the small circle of loyal individuals who had fought beside her when the world tried to tear her apart. There was peace in that. Real peace. Not the artificial fantasy Julian once pretended to offer her, but something earned through pain, survival, and truth. Halfway through the evening, Audrey's burner phone vibrated quietly in her bag. She almost ignored it until she noticed the unknown number. For a moment, an old instinct tightened inside her chest. Slowly, she opened the message. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I destroyed everything. But before my mother poisoned my mind completely, I did love you. I hope someday you find happiness. Julian. Audrey stared at the screen silently while the ocean rolled beneath the yacht. 15 years in federal prison had apparently reduced Julian Kensington to lonely regrets and desperate apologies. Maybe he truly loved her once, maybe he didn't. In the end, it no longer mattered. Some betrayals cut too deeply to ever heal cleanly. Some actions permanently erase the right to redemption. Without a flicker of emotion, Audrey deleted the message, blocked the number, and slipped the phone back into her bag. Then she returned her attention to Valerie's passionate explanation about a new clinical research project that could potentially extend survival rates for terminal patients. That was what mattered now. The future. The company she built with her own hands. The lives she could still save. The ocean breeze swept across the deck again, but this time it didn't carry fear with it. Audrey walked toward the railing and looked down at the dark Atlantic water glowing beneath the moonlight. Years ago, that same ocean had nearly become her grave. Julian and Margaret believed they could throw her into darkness and erase her existence for profit. Instead, the ocean became the place where Audrey Kensington was reborn. She survived. She fought back. She destroyed the people who tried to destroy her. Margaret died alone in federal prison 6 years later, bitter and forgotten, buried in an unmarked grave with nobody left willing to claim her body. Julian vanished into obscurity after serving his sentence, living under a paranoid alias in a remote town where nobody knew his name. Their empire collapsed into dust while Audrey's continued rising higher than ever. Renee stepped beside her at the railing and smirked faintly. You know what their biggest mistake was? Audrey glanced toward her. Thinking I was weak, Renee shook her head. No. Thinking survival would break you instead of turning you into someone they could never control. Audrey smiled slowly as the yacht cut forward through the endless black water. For the first time in years, the ocean no longer looked terrifying. It looked peaceful, free. And as the lights of Miami shimmered in the distance behind her, Audrey realized something profound. Revenge had never truly been about watching Julian and Margaret suffer. The real victory was standing here alive, successful, untouchable, and entirely free, while the people who tried to bury her had already destroyed themselves.